The sun was a hammer, and the dust was its anvil. It beat down on the Rawlings auction yard, forging the air into a shimmering weapon that stole breath and blurred vision. The smell was a trinity of sweat, manure, and cheap liquor, a pungent incense for the day's worship of coin and horseflesh. Men in stained hats and worn boots leaned against splintered railings, their faces carved by sun and skepticism. They were a jury of hard-bitten experience, and their verdicts were swift, cynical, and usually correct. Silas Ward stood apart from them, a quiet island in a river of coarse chatter and knowing nods. He wasn't a tall man, nor a loud one, but he possessed a stillness that made others feel restless. His hands, resting on the top rail, were maps of a life spent with reins and rope, sun and soil. He saw the world not in words, but in textures, in the subtle shifts of weight and weather. Today, he was watching the auctioneer, Otis Caldwell, a man whose voice was as polished and insincere as a saloon piano. Otis sold animals not as living creatures but as assets and liabilities, his tongue turning bone and sinew into profit margins and potential losses. "All right, gentlemen, settle down, settle down." Otis's voice boomed, a caricature of enthusiasm. "Next up, lot 73. A real specimen." He paused, and a few men chuckled. The gate creaked open, and a groom led a horse into the ring. The creature was a void, a hole in the blinding sunlight. A black Mustang, his coat so matted with filth and burrs it drank the light and gave nothing back. But it was his posture that silenced the last of the snickers and replaced them with a low murmur of pity and dismissal. His head hung so low his muzzle nearly brushed the churned-up dirt. His spine was a sad, defeated curve. One ear lopped sideways, and his eyes, when he bothered to lift them for a split second, were dull, glazed pools of nothing. He flinched when the groom tugged the rope, a pathetic, hopeless shudder that spoke of a spirit not just broken, but ground into dust and scattered. "A black Mustang, gelding, age unknown, but he's seen a few winters," Otis announced, his voice losing its customary flourish. He was selling a ghost. "As you can see, he's tractable, quiet, very quiet. What am I bid for this horse?" The word hung in the air, an ill-fitting garment. $50 for the knackerman," someone shouted from the back, followed by a wave of dry laughter. "He ain't worth the bullet," another voice added. Silas ignored them. He wasn't looking at the bowed head or the matted coat. He was looking at the feet. Beneath the dirt and the posture of utter collapse, the horse stood perfectly square. There was no favoring of a leg, no subtle shift to ease an old injury. The hooves, though cracked and dry, were positioned with an unconscious geometric precision. It was a tiny detail, a whisper in a storm of obvious brokenness, but it snagged in Silas's mind. Then he saw the second thing. As a fly landed on the horse's flank, the skin didn't just twitch. A single isolated muscle, no bigger than a silver dollar, convulsed with lightning speed and sent the insect buzzing away. It was a movement of such minute control, so at odds with the creature's overall presentation of ruin, that Silas felt a jolt run through him. It was like watching a beggar on the street corner and noticing he was wearing a cartographer's watch. "Do I hear $20? 20 for the lot?" Otis pleaded, trying to salvage some dignity from the farce. Mercy Whitmore, whose ranch bordered Silas's own, sidled up next to him. She was a woman whose opinions were as sharp and frequent as the summer hail. "Don't even think about it, Silas," she said, her voice low and certain. "That thing's got the quit in him so deep, you'd need a drill to find the bottom. He'll eat your hay and die in your barn, and that'll be the end of it." Silas didn't answer. He watched as the horse, for a fleeting instant, lifted its head just enough for its eyes to sweep the perimeter of the yard. It wasn't a look of fear or confusion. It was an assessment. A quick, fluid, and comprehensive scan of every exit, every face, every shadow. The glance lasted no more than a second before the mask of defeat slammed back into place, the head dropping as if weighed down by a terrible gravity. But Silas had seen it. He had felt it. In that 1 second, He had seen a flash of something so fiercely intelligent, so profoundly aware, that the pity he'd felt moments before curdled into a deep and unsettling intrigue. This wasn't a victim. This was a performance. $20? I got 20 from the man in the back, Otis said, latching onto a pity bid. Do I hear 30? $30? The crowd was silent. They had already passed judgment. The horse was a write-off, a sad story to be forgotten before the next, more promising animal entered the ring. Silas felt the word form in his throat, a quiet act of rebellion against the collective certainty of the crowd. It wasn't a calculation. It was an answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. He trusted the knot in his gut, the instinct that had guided him through blizzards and droughts, the one that told him when a calf was lying about being healthy or when the sky was lying about the rain. And his gut was telling him that the saddest horse he had ever seen was also the biggest liar. 100, Silas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the heat and the chatter like a shard of cool stone. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Mercy Whitmore stared at him as if he'd just announced his intention to fly. Otis Caldwell's eyes widened. $100 from Silas Ward? I've got 100, do I hear 110? 100, going once? The scarred man standing near the entrance, who had been watching the proceedings with a bored, predatory stillness, suddenly straightened. His gaze, which had been sweeping the crowd, locked onto the Mustang, and then onto Silas. His eyes were chips of obsidian, and a long white scar pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. He hadn't shown a flicker of interest before, but Silas's bid had tripped a wire. He exchanged a look with one of the half-dozen rough-looking men flanking him, a silent, sharp communication that made the air around them feel colder. "Going twice," Otis chanted, his professional glee returning. The silence from the crowd was now one of bewilderment. Silas Ward wasn't a fool. He was one of the shrewdest ranchers in the territory. If he saw something, maybe, but no. They looked back at the pathetic creature in the ring, and their certainty returned. Silas had finally let the sun cook his good sense. "Sold!" Otis's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "To Silas Ward for $100. Son, you just bought yourself a horse." The finality of the sound seemed to echo in the oppressive heat. The men around him began to talk again, the moment of strangeness passing. Mercy just shook her head, a tight, disappointed line to her mouth. "It's your money to burn, Silas. Your money and your time to bury him." Silas didn't hear her. He was watching the scarred man who was now staring at him, not with anger, but with a chilling, proprietary intensity. It was the look of a man who had just seen someone walk away with his misplaced wallet. As Silas moved toward the holding pens to claim his purchase, the scarred man and his crew faded back into the crowd, melting away like shadows at noon. But the coldness of his stare lingered, a premonition that Silas had bought far more than just a broken-down horse. He had bought a secret, and the price was yet to be determined. The journey back to the ranch was a study in contradictions. The Mustang, which Silas decided to call Sterling for the faint, hidden sheen he imagined lay beneath the grime, should have stumbled. He should have dragged his feet, a picture of the misery he'd projected in the ring. Instead, he walked with a gait so smooth and economical it was practically silent. His hooves fell with a precision that belied the cracked, untended horn, each step placed to conserve the maximum amount of energy. Leading him by a simple rope, Silas felt no resistance, no pulling, just a steady, intelligent yielding to the pressure. It was the walk of an animal that had covered immense distances and knew the value of every movement. The bowed head and defeated posture remained, a meticulously maintained disguise, but the engine beneath it was that of a finely tuned machine. Silas felt like he was leading a shadow, a creature of immense substance that chose to leave almost no impression on the world. His ranch was nestled in a small valley, a collection of sturdy, unadorned buildings that spoke of function over form. A weathered barn, a simple clapboard house, and a web of fences that stretched out to embrace the rolling, golden hills. It was a place of solitude, a kingdom of quiet work, and self-reliance. As he led Sterling into the main corral, the horse finally lifted his head, his eyes sweeping the layout of the ranch, the house, the barn, the water trough, the distant line of the hills, with that same unnerving, comprehensive glance he'd used at the auction. He was mapping the terrain, noting every detail. Then, as if remembering his role, his head drooped once more, the mask of brokenness sliding back into place. Silas filled a trough with fresh, cool water from the well. Sterling drank deeply, but with a strange neatness, barely disturbing the surface. Silas then offered him a scoop of the finest oats, the kind he saved for mares in foal. Sterling sniffed it once, his nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly, and then turned his head away, his interest utterly feigned. He ignored the rich grain and instead began to lip at a few stray blades of dry grass near the fence post, an action of pure misdirection. Grain was a gift, a dependency. Grass was survival. This horse, Silas realized, was a survivalist. The first few days fell into a strange rhythm. During the day, Sterling was a ghost in the corral. He would stand for hours in one spot, head hung low, a perfect statue of despair. He moved only to drink or to nibble disinterestedly at the hay Silas provided. He was the worthless, broken animal everyone at the auction had seen. Mercy Whitmore came by on the second day, leaning on the corral fence, her arms crossed. "Still breathing, is he?" she asked, her voice dripping with vindication. "I give him another week. You're a good man, Silas, but your heart's too soft for your own wallet." "He's settling in," Silas replied, his voice even. He didn't try to explain the perfectly placed feet or the intelligent eyes. He knew it would sound like madness, like a man trying to justify a foolish mistake. His isolation felt keener with her standing there, her certainty a wall he couldn't breach with his unproven intuition. "Settling into what? The dirt he'll be buried in?" she scoffed, pushing off the fence. "Just don't come asking me for help digging the hole." She rode off, leaving Silas alone with his silent, enigmatic charge. Her visit, meant to be a simple "I told you so," only served to sharpen the edges of the mystery. He was on one side of a deep chasm of understanding, and the rest of the world, represented by Mercy, was on the other. The tension in him grew, a quiet, humming wire. He found himself watching Sterling constantly, trying to catch another glimpse of the truth behind the facade. He'd see it in a flicker of an ear swiveling to track a hawk in the sky while the head remained bowed, or in the way the horse's weight would shift with subtle, coiled power when Silas approached from a blind spot. These were micro-expressions, tiny tells in a masterful poker game, and they screamed a truth that the larger picture was designed to hide. This was no ordinary horse. This was a fugitive. The third night was moonless, the sky a spill of black ink salted with stars. A restless energy had settled over the ranch, a feeling Silas knew well. It was the feeling that preceded a storm, a shift in the world. He couldn't sleep. The image of Sterling's controlled, assessing gaze was burned into his mind. He pulled on his boots, left the house in silence, and moved toward the barn, his steps muffled by the thick dust. The barn door was open a crack, a habit of his on warm nights. A low lamp cast long, dancing shadows inside. He didn't go in. He stayed in the darkness, peering through the gap between the door and its frame. For a long moment, everything was as he expected. Sterling stood in the large stall Silas had given him, his head hung in that familiar, pathetic posture. He looked like he hadn't moved in hours. Silas almost turned to leave, almost dismissed the nagging feeling as a product of his own fatigue. And then it happened. Slowly, deliberately, Sterling lifted his head. The movement was fluid, like water flowing uphill. His spine straightened, the defeated curve vanishing, replaced by a line of immense power. His ears no longer lopped, pricked forward, sharp and alert, swiveling independently to sample the sounds of the night. He was taller than Silas had realized, his frame lean but corded with muscle that now stood out in sharp relief under the lamplight. The dullness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a brilliant, focused intelligence that seemed to glow from within. The transformation was so absolute, so shocking. It was as if one horse had been swapped for another. The victim was gone. In its place stood a soldier. Sterling took a step, and the sound was wrong. There was none of the heavy clop of a normal horse. His hoof met the straw-covered floor with a soft, deliberate press, a ranger's tread. He walked the perimeter of the stall, a silent, methodical patrol. His eyes scanned every board, every nail. He reached the gate, and instead of rattling it, he nudged the latch with his nose. He didn't push or shove, he investigated it, testing its strength, its mechanism, the way a safecracker would test a tumbler. He moved with the predatory grace of a panther, his body a coiled spring, every ounce of his being radiating a potent combination of discipline and danger. He was checking his cage, assessing his containment. Silas stood frozen in the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs, the breath caught in his throat. Every instinct he'd ever had, every subtle clue he'd collected over the past 3 days, coalesced into a single, terrifying, and magnificent truth. He hadn't rescued a broken animal. He had unwittingly provided sanctuary to a master of deception, a highly trained creature hiding from something or someone in plain sight. The pity he had felt at the auction seemed like a naive folly, replaced by a profound and chilling respect. The question was no longer what Sterling was, but who had made him this way. And as Sterling continued his silent, vigilant patrol inside the barn, Silas felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He was no longer just a rancher with a new horse. He was a man harboring a secret, and he had a terrible feeling that the secret was about to come knocking. The peace of his valley had been an illusion, and the storm he'd felt brewing was no longer on the horizon. It was right here, inside his barn, waiting. The dawn did little to dispel the chill of the night's revelation. Silas moved through his morning chores in a haze, his world tilted on its axis. Every glance toward the corral was loaded with new meaning. He saw the drooping head and knew it was a lie. He saw the placid stillness and knew it was a mask for a coiled, waiting power. He was an audience of one for a performance of a lifetime, and the actor was a horse. He felt a strange mix of fear and admiration. Fear of the unknown danger Sterling was clearly hiding from, and admiration for the sheer intelligence and discipline it took to maintain such a flawless deception. He was tending to a ghost, a warrior in a pauper's cloak, and the silence between them was no longer empty, but filled with 1,000 unasked questions. He was mending a fence line at the far edge of his property when he first heard it. A frantic, desperate drumming of hooves, too fast and erratic for a casual rider. Silas straightened up, his hand shielding his eyes against the morning sun. A plume of dust was rising from the direction of the main road, moving toward his ranch with alarming speed. It was the sound of panic. He dropped his tools and began to walk quickly back toward the house, his gut twisting into a cold knot. The storm was breaking. A small pinto pony burst into the yard, lathered in sweat, its sides heaving. On its back was a boy, no more than 12 or 13, his face pale with terror and streaked with tears and dust. He slid from the saddle before the pony had even stopped, stumbling as his feet hit the ground. "Mr. Ward! Mr. Ward!" the boy cried, his voice cracking with desperation. Silas recognized him now. It was Tommy Chen, the son of the quiet man who ran the general store in the nearby town of Redemption. "Tommy, what is it? What's wrong?" Silas asked, his voice calm and steady, trying to anchor the boy's panic. "It's my PA!" the boy sobbed, pointing a trembling finger back down the road. "They took him! They came to the store! Men! Bad men!" Silas's blood ran cold. He knelt, putting his hands on the boy's shoulders. "Easy now, son. Tell me what happened. Who took him?" "3 of them," Tommy gasped, struggling for breath. They said he'd be fine. They said they don't want to hurt him. They just want their property back. They said a rancher bought it at the Rawlings auction. A black Mustang." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. The world seemed to shrink and sharpen, focused down to the single terrifying point of this new reality. The secret was out. The danger he had sensed was no longer a vague premonition. It had a name, and it had a victim. Mr. Chen, an innocent man, a good man, was now a pawn in a game Silas hadn't even known he was playing. He looked over at the corral. Sterling, who had been standing in his usual defeated slump, had his head up. Not the full, proud carriage of the night before, but a subtle lift, his one good ear cocked in their direction, listening. He knew. He sensed the shift, the arrival of the very threat he had been hiding from. "They're coming here," Silas said, more to himself than to the boy. It wasn't a question. "They said they'd be right behind me," Tommy confirmed, his eyes wide with fear. "They said if they don't get their horse, they'll... He couldn't finish the sentence, his face crumbling into a fresh wave of tears. "It's all right, son. We'll get him back," Silas said, the words feeling hollow even to him. How? How could one man and a horse, no matter how intelligent, stand against a group of violent men? As if in answer, Sterling took a step forward. He looked directly at Silas, and the last vestiges of the broken-down facade fell away. His head came all the way up, his neck arched, his eyes blazing with a fierce, lucid light. It was a declaration. The performance was over. He then did something that made Silas's breath catch in his chest. He lowered himself onto one knee, then the other, sinking into a formal bow, his head lowered to the ground in a gesture of absolute discipline, a movement straight out of a cavalry training manual. He held the position for a beat, a soldier reporting for duty, and then rose with that same fluid power he displayed in the barn. It was a direct communication, a display of his training, a confirmation of everything Tommy had just said. "This is who I am," the gesture screamed, "and they are the ones who made me." Silas's mind raced, trying to piece it together. The systematic dehumanization, the training for absolute obedience mixed with combat readiness. It was the work of men who created living weapons, men who would view a creature like Sterling not as a partner, but as a priceless, dangerous asset. Men who would kidnap an innocent storekeeper to retrieve their property. A low rumble reached them then, carried on the wind, the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Not one horse, but several, moving at a steady, menacing pace. There was no time to run, no time to get help, no time to think. There was only the yard, the boy, the horse, and the approaching doom. "Tommy, get in the house, lock the door, and stay away from the windows," Silas commanded, his voice sharp with an authority the boy didn't question. Tommy scrambled toward the house, his small face a mask of terror. Silas turned to face Sterling. The horse stood alert, his muscles taut, his gaze fixed on the road. The air between them crackled with unspoken understanding. The time for secrets was over. The time for choices had been reduced to a single, irreversible moment. Silas walked to the corral gate, his movements deliberate, his mind strangely calm. The fear was still there, a cold stone in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a surge of something else, a fierce, defiant resolve. He had made a choice at that auction, a choice to see past the surface, to trust his gut. Now, he had to see it through. He swung the gate open. "All right, Sterling," Silas said, his voice low. "It seems the past has caught up with us." Sterling walked out of the corral, not with the hesitant steps of a domestic animal, but with the measured, confident tread of a warrior stepping onto the battlefield. He stopped beside Silas, a silent, powerful ally. Man and horse stood together in the dusty yard, two quiet figures against the vastness of the prairie, turning to face the sound of the approaching riders. They were out of time, out of options, and hopelessly outgunned. And yet, as Silas looked at the magnificent, defiant creature beside him, he felt not despair, but the dawning of a terrible and righteous wrath. The choice had been made. Now came the reckoning. The three riders who emerged from the dust cloud were exactly as Silas had imagined. Hard men on hard-looking horses. They fanned out as they entered the yard, a classic intimidation tactic, their movements professional and menacing. The man in the middle, a lean figure with a cruel twist to his mouth, was likely the lieutenant. The other two were bulky enforcers, their eyes cold and empty. They were not the scarred man from the auction, but they carried his authority like a brand. "Silas Ward," the leader called out, his voice laced with a lazy arrogance. He brought his horse to a halt about 20 yards from where Silas stood with Sterling. "I'm Ward," Silas replied, his voice steady. His hands were loose at his sides. He was acutely aware of the shotgun just inside his front door, a useless 50 feet away. The leader's eyes slid past Silas and fixed on Sterling. A slow, unpleasant smile spread across his face. It was a smile of ownership, of possession. "Well now, look what we have here. Dropped the sad little act, did we, Breaker?" The name was a sneer, a reminder of the horse's purpose and creation. "You've caused us a whole lot of trouble. The boss is displeased." Sterling didn't react, but Silas could feel the tension radiating from him, a low hum of contained energy. The horse's stillness was not passive. It was predatory. "I believe you have something that belongs to us," the leader continued, gesturing toward Sterling. "We also have something that belongs to a friend of yours, a Mr. Chen. I propose a simple trade." "Let the boy's father go," Silas said, his voice hard. "This is between you and me." The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Oh no, this is between us and him," he said, nodding at Sterling. "You're just the fool who got in the way. Now step aside from the horse." Silas stood his ground. He looked at the three men, at their confident smirks, at the rifles sheathed in their saddles. He thought of Mr. Chen, a kind man who sold candy to children, now a hostage because of a choice Silas had made. The cold stone of fear in his gut began to burn, turning into a hot, cleansing anger. He had made a promise to the boy. He gave Sterling the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of pure trust, a release. "Your fight," it said. "Our stand." In the space between one heartbeat and the next, Sterling exploded into motion. It wasn't the wild, panicked bolt of a frightened horse. It was a launch. He shot forward, not at the leader, but at the rider on the right. The man's eyes widened in surprise, his hand instinctively going for his rifle. He was too slow. Sterling didn't charge head-on. He feinted left, and then cut right with impossible agility, his shoulder slamming into the flank of the man's horse. The impact was brutal. The other horse staggered, throwing the rider off balance. In that same fluid motion, Sterling's head snaked out, his teeth clamping down on the leather of the rifle scabbard and yanking it free. The rifle clattered to the ground as the rider fought to control his panicked mount. The leader and the second henchman spurred their horses forward, shouting in anger and surprise. They had expected a man, perhaps with a gun. They were not prepared for a four-legged tactician. The second henchman drew a pistol, but aiming from a moving horse at a target that flowed like smoke was impossible. Sterling, having dealt with the first threat, spun on his haunches. The maneuver was so tight and fast it seemed to defy physics. He was now facing the second henchman, who was charging in. Sterling lowered his head and drove forward, not as a battering ram, but as a wedge. He drove between the man and his target, Silas, forcing the horse to swerve. As he passed, Sterling lashed out with a hind leg. It wasn't a wild kick. It was a targeted strike, a martial artist's blow. The hoof connected squarely with the man's knee. A sickening crunch echoed through the yard, followed by a scream of agony. The man dropped his pistol, his leg useless, and slumped in the saddle, clutching his shattered joint. 2 down. The leader, his face now a mask of fury, reined his horse in, his arrogance replaced by a grudging respect. "You trained him well, you son of a bitch!" he spat, mistakenly attributing the horse's skill to Silas. He drew his own weapon, a heavy revolver, and leveled it. Silas knew this was the most dangerous moment. A stationary target was a dead one. But Sterling wasn't stationary. He began to move in a tight, weaving circle, a mesmerizing dance that made him a constantly shifting target. He was daring the man to shoot, drawing his fire, controlling the engagement. Silas, realizing his role, didn't just hang on. He became part of the dance. He shifted his weight, guiding Sterling with the pressure of his knees, their minds seemingly linked. He leaned low over the horse's neck, making himself as small a target as possible. The leader fired. The shot went wide, kicking up a spray of dust behind them. He fired again, the bullet whistling past Silas's ear. Sterling used the sound and flash to time his next move. As the hammer fell for a third shot, he lunged forward, closing the distance with breathtaking speed. The leader's horse shied back, startled by the sudden aggressive charge. The man's aim was thrown off. Before he could recover, Sterling was on him. He reared up, not in fear, but in dominance. His front hooves, shod in iron, were not weapons of desperation but tools of disarming. One hoof struck the man's gun hand, sending the revolver flying. The other slammed down on the man's shoulder, a blow that drove the air from his lungs and nearly unseated him. The man, disarmed and reeling, stared at the black Mustang before him, his face a mixture of pain and disbelief. He had lost. He had been systematically and humiliatingly dismantled by the very property he had come to reclaim. He yanked his horse's head around and spurred it savagely, galloping back the way he came, a retreat of pure terror. The other two, one nursing a broken knee and the other struggling with his spooked horse, followed his lead, fleeing the yard in a chaotic, desperate scramble. Silence descended, broken only by the heaving breaths of man and horse and the distant fading sound of hoofbeats. Silas slid from Sterling's back, his legs trembling from adrenaline. He looked at the discarded rifle and pistol in the dust. He looked at Sterling, who stood proud and magnificent, his coat gleaming with sweat, his eyes bright with the fire of victorious combat. He had not just fought, he had performed a symphony of controlled violence, protecting his partner, defending their home. But the fight wasn't over. It was just the first act. "They'll be back," Silas said, his voice raspy. "And they'll go to their boss." Sterling nudged Silas with his head, a gesture of affirmation. Then he turned his gaze toward the east, toward the jagged maw of the canyon that cut through the far side of the valley. Dead Man's Canyon. It was a place of ill repute, a labyrinth of rock and shadow, a natural fortress, a perfect place for an ambush, a perfect place to hold a hostage. "They have your father in the canyon, Tommy," Silas said, his voice heavy with certainty as the boy crept out of the house, his eyes wide. "That's where they'll have gone, to regroup." The logic was cold and clear. The three riders were just a retrieval team. The main group, with the scarred man and Mr. Chen, would be waiting at a secure location. The fleeing riders weren't just retreating, they were leading them into a larger trap. Silas looked at Sterling. The horse met his gaze, his intelligence burning. There was no question of waiting for the sheriff, who would be hours away at best. Mr. Chen didn't have hours. The decision was already made, sealed in the violence of the last 5 minutes. Silas picked up the leader's discarded revolver, checked its load, and tucked it into his belt. He felt its alien weight against his side. He was a rancher, a man of peace. But peace was a luxury he could no longer afford. He swung himself back onto Sterling's bare back. The horse's muscles were taut beneath him, a promise of speed and power. "All right, Sterling," Silas whispered, leaning forward. "Let's go get him back." With a toss of his head, Sterling wheeled and broke into a gallop, not toward the road, but straight across the golden fields, a black arrow aimed at the heart of Dead Man's Canyon. They were riding toward a trap, knowingly, willingly. A man and a horse, partners in a desperate gamble, racing toward a confrontation with 7 armed men and the brutal past that had forged a warrior in a victim's disguise. The entrance to Dead Man's Canyon was a jagged wound in the earth, a narrow slit between towering walls of red rock that seemed to bleed into the sky. The air grew still and heavy as they entered, the open sounds of the prairie replaced by a deadened, watchful silence. The ground was treacherous, littered with loose scree and sharp stones, but Sterling moved with the same impossible grace, his hooves finding purchase where there seemed to be none. Silas rode low, his senses on fire. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whisper. He held the revolver, its cold weight a poor comfort against the odds they faced. He was a rancher with a stolen gun, riding a horse of unknown provenance into a den of professional kidnappers. It was madness. But as he felt the steady, powerful rhythm of Sterling's stride beneath him, the unwavering confidence of the animal, he knew it was the only path forward. They followed the trail left by the three fleeing riders, a clear track in the sandy wash of the canyon floor. The canyon twisted and turned, a natural labyrinth designed to confuse and ensnare. After a mile, it opened into a wider box canyon, a natural amphitheater of stone. And there they were. 4 men were positioned on the low bluffs on either side, rifles cradled in their arms. At the far end of the canyon, standing beside a cluster of tethered horses, were the 3 riders from the yard, one of them leaning heavily on his saddle, his face pale with pain. Standing before them all was the scarred man. He was taller than Silas remembered from the auction, with a coiled, serpentine stillness that made him the undeniable center of gravity. His scarred mouth was pulled into a triumphant sneer, and beside him, his hands bound, a gag in his mouth, was the slender, terrified figure of Mr. Chen. They were boxed in, a perfect trap. "Well, well," the scarred man's voice echoed off the canyon walls, dripping with condescending amusement. "The fool and the traitor! I must admit I'm impressed, both of you. You, for having the gall to ride in here, and you," he said, his voice dropping as he addressed Sterling, "for remembering your lessons so well. You always were my finest creation." Sterling stood his ground, his gaze locked on the scarred man. There was no fear in his eyes, only a cold, burning hatred. It was the look of a prisoner confronting his jailer. "You see, Mr. Ward," the scarred man continued, taking a step forward, "you think you bought a horse. What you bought is a weapon, a highly specialized, incredibly valuable piece of military hardware, forged in pain and fear, disciplined with a fire that would break any other living thing. He is programmed for 2 things, to perform and to destroy, and he responds only to my authority." He snapped his fingers, a sharp, cracking sound. "Breaker! Kneel!" The command hung in the silent air. Silas felt Sterling's muscles tense beneath him, a tremor of rebellion, of pure, defiant rage. For a terrifying second, Silas thought Sterling would charge, a suicidal assault against 7 rifles. But then, the years of brutal, ingrained conditioning took hold. Slowly, agonizingly, Sterling's front legs began to buckle. It was not the smooth, disciplined bow he had shown Silas in the yard. This was a movement of torment, of a will being bent and broken. His head lowered, his eyes squeezing shut as if in pain. He sank to his knees in the dust, a warrior forced into submission before his tyrant. Mr. Chen let out a muffled sob from behind his gag. The henchmen on the bluffs chuckled, their rifles held loosely. The tension had broken. The legendary breaker was broken once more. "You see?" the scarred man said softly, his voice full of venomous pride. "Ownership is not a piece of paper from an auctioneer. It is a brand on the soul. He is mine. He has always been mine." He turned to 2 of his men. "Go get him, and bring me the rancher." As the 2 men started to walk forward, Silas knew this was their only chance, a sliver of an opening born from the enemy's arrogance. He leaned forward, his mouth close to Sterling's ear, the skin of which was twitching with suppressed fury. He didn't have the command words. He didn't know the training. But he had something the scarred man had never possessed. Trust. "Sterling," he whispered, his voice a bare thread of sound. "The performance is yours, not his. Choose your stage. Choose your ending. On my mark. Free yourself." It was a gamble on a soul, a prayer whispered into a storm. He felt a subtle shift in the muscles of the horse's back, an infinitesimal tightening, an acknowledgement, a decision. The 2 henchmen were halfway across the canyon floor. The scarred man was watching them, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. This was the moment. "Now," Silas breathed. What happened next was not an explosion. It was an unraveling. Sterling did not leap to his feet. Instead, still on his knees, he began to sway. It was a strange, mesmerizing motion, a slow, rhythmic rocking that seemed to be a display of utter mental collapse. He swung his head from side to side, his eyes half closed, a picture of a creature that had finally snapped. The approaching men paused, confused. The men on the bluffs lowered their rifles slightly, intrigued by the bizarre display. The scarred man's smile faltered, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. This was not part of the programming. The sway became more pronounced, a hypnotic pendulum. He was drawing their eyes, lulling their senses, pulling every bit of focus in the canyon onto his strange, broken dance. It was a performance, but it was his performance, a mesmerizing prelude to chaos. And then, in the middle of a long, slow sway to the right, he transformed. The rocking motion coiled into a spin. Still on his knees, he pirouetted with the speed of a dust devil, his body a low, blurring scythe. His head, no longer drooping, lashed out. His teeth clamped onto the ankle of the first henchman, and he pulled. The man screamed as he was yanked off his feet, his head cracking against the stony ground. Sterling released him and in the same continuous spin, kicked out with his hind legs. He was still on his knees, but the kick had the force of a battering ram, catching the second henchman in the gut and sending him flying backward, gasping for air. In the space of 3 seconds, he had incapacitated both men without ever getting to his feet. He rose then, not with a leap, but with a fluid surge of power, a black wave cresting. The scarred man shouted, "Shoot him! Shoot him now!" But it was too late. Sterling was in motion, a blur of black against the red rock. He was not a target. He was a phenomenon. He charged not at the scarred man, but at the cluster of tethered horses. He slammed into them, not to harm them, but to create chaos. He snapped reins with his teeth, bucking and shouldering the animals, sending them scattering in a panic of flying hooves and whinnies. The canyon floor was suddenly a maelstrom of terrified horses, a living, moving shield. The men on the bluffs couldn't get a clear shot. Their own horses were now a liability, a stampeding herd between them and their target. Sterling moved through the chaos he had created, a predator in his element. He burst through the other side of the herd and charged up the scree slope toward the 2 men on the right bluff. They fumbled with their rifles, unprepared for a frontal assault up a nearly sheer cliff. Sterling scrambled up the loose rock like a mountain goat, his powerful haunches driving him upward. The first man managed to fire a shot, but it went wild. Before he could fire again, Sterling was on him. He didn't trample him. He ran past him, and as he did, his shoulder slammed into the man's chest, knocking him off the narrow ledge. He fell with a cry, landing hard on the canyon floor below. The second man, seeing his fate, simply dropped his rifle and tried to scramble away, his nerve completely broken. 4 down, 3 to go. On the opposite bluff, the remaining 2 riflemen stood frozen, their faces etched with disbelief. They watched as Sterling, without pausing, galloped along the canyon rim, a black silhouette against the sky, and began to descend the other side, coming for them. Down below, the scarred man stood in shock, his perfect trap dismantled, his control shattered. He looked at the chaos, at his men being systematically taken apart by the creature he had forged. He saw not a tool, but a rebellion. His face contorted in a mask of pure rage. He drew a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt and grabbed Mr. Chen, holding the blade to his throat. "Breaker!" he screamed, his voice raw with fury. "Stop! Stop or the man dies! I swear I'll cut his throat!" Sterling, halfway down the far slope, froze. He stood poised on the rock face, his muscles quivering. He looked from the 2 remaining riflemen above him to the scene below. His tormentor, the knife, the innocent hostage. He was caught. Silas, still on Sterling's back, felt the horse's terrible dilemma. He could feel the rage, the desire to finish it, warring with the ingrained command and the sight of the hostage. In that moment of hesitation, Silas knew his role had changed. He was not just a passenger, he was a partner. He drew the revolver. The weight was still unfamiliar, the balance wrong in his hand. He had only ever fired a gun at coyotes or for practice. But his eye was true, honed by years of reading the subtle movements of animals. He saw the scarred man, his attention locked on Sterling. He saw the glint of the knife at Mr. Chen's throat. He saw the last two henchmen on the bluff, starting to bring their rifles to bear. There was no time for a clean shot, no time for aiming. There was only instinct, the same instinct that had told him to buy the horse. "Sterling, go!" Silas yelled. And as the horse leaped down the final stretch of the slope, Silas raised the revolver and fired, not at the scarred man, at the rock face just above his head. The bullet struck the weathered sandstone, and a shower of rock chips and dust exploded downward. It wasn't a lethal attack, but it was a perfect distraction. The scarred man flinched instinctively, raising an arm to shield his face. In that split second of distraction, his grip on Mr. Chen loosened, the knife moving a precious few inches away from his throat. It was all the opening Sterling needed. He hit the canyon floor at a full gallop. He wasn't a horse anymore. He was a force of nature, a living thunderbolt. He covered the 50 yards to the scarred man in a blur of motion. The tyrant, his eyes wide with terror, tried to bring the knife back to bear, but he was far too slow. Sterling didn't slow down. He didn't rear or bite. He ran through him. His shoulder, a solid wall of muscle and bone, struck the scarred man squarely in the chest. There was a hideous, snapping sound, and the man was thrown backward as if he'd been hit by a train. He flew 10 feet through the air, his limbs flailing, and landed in a crumpled heap, his body broken and still. The knife clattered uselessly onto the rocks. The final two henchmen on the bluff stared down at the scene, at their fallen leader, at the terrifying black horse standing over his body, its chest heaving. One of them slowly, deliberately, placed his rifle on the ground and raised his hands. The other, after a moment's hesitation, did the same. It was over. The canyon fell into a profound silence, broken only by the whimpering of the injured men and the ragged breathing of Sterling. He stood over the body of his creator, not in triumph, but in finality. He had not just defeated his enemy, he had dismantled the structure of his own past. He had used the brutal skills forced upon him not for oppression, but for liberation. He was no longer Breaker, the weapon. He was Sterling, the warrior, who had, with the trust of a quiet rancher, reclaimed his own soul in a crucible of rock and retribution. Silas slid from his back, his entire body shaking, and went to cut Mr. Chen free. The storekeeper, weeping with relief, stumbled into his arms, and in the center of the canyon, surrounded by his defeated foes, the black Mustang lifted his head and let out a long, clear cry, not a sound of anger or of pain, but a declaration of freedom that echoed off the stone walls and rose into the boundless open sky. The arrival of Sheriff Morrison and his posse felt like an epilogue to a story that had already reached its visceral conclusion. Tommy Chen, having seen the direction Silas and Sterling had taken, had ridden his pinto pony half to death to reach the town of Redemption and fetch the law. They found a scene of stunning, almost theatrical clarity. 7 men, a notorious gang of horse thieves and contract muscle wanted in 2 territories, were scattered across the canyon floor. Disarmed, incapacitated, their reign of terror ended not by a hail of bullets, but by the precise, strategic fury of a single horse. Sheriff Morrison, a man who thought he had seen everything the frontier had to offer, stared in disbelief. He looked at the shattered knee, the unconscious bodies, the broken form of the infamous scarred man, whose real name no one even knew. Then he looked at the 2 men standing with their hands raised on the bluff, their faces showing not defiance, but a kind of awestruck terror. His gaze fell upon the other horses, the antagonists' mounts, who were now standing in a quiet, subdued cluster, their heads lowered, instinctively deferential to the magnificent black Mustang standing calmly beside Silas Ward. "Silas," the sheriff said, his voice gravelly with astonishment. "What in God's name happened here?" Silas, who was helping a shaken but unharmed Mr. Chen to his feet, simply looked at Sterling. "He got his property back," Silas said. The words were for the sheriff, but the meaning was for the horse. He wasn't talking about Mr. Chen. He was talking about Sterling's freedom. The posse rounded up the henchmen, their professional bravado replaced by the sullen silence of the defeated. As they cuffed the scarred man's lieutenant, the one with the cruel sneer from Silas's yard, the man looked at Sterling with a venomous hatred. "That horse, he's a monster." "No," Silas said quietly, walking over. "He's not a monster. You just taught him how to fight them." The ride home was quiet. Mr. Chen, riding one of the posse's extra horses, was too overwhelmed with gratitude to speak much, offering Silas his thanks in choked, emotional whispers. But the most profound communication was the silence between Silas and Sterling. They moved across the plains as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The gait of the horse was the same smooth, powerful rhythm as before, but the meaning had changed. It was no longer the stride of a fugitive, but of a partner. Silas didn't hold the reins. He rested a hand on Sterling's neck, feeling the warmth and the life, the incredible strength held in check. He was not a man on his property. They were two survivors, two soldiers returning from a war they had won together. They had faced death in that canyon, and in doing so, had forged a bond stronger than any steel, deeper than any words. When they reached the ranch, the familiar buildings seemed different, imbued with a new sense of sanctuary. It was no longer just a place of solitude. It was a place that had been defended, a home that had been earned. Silas dismounted, his body aching with a weariness that went bone deep. He led Sterling not to the corral, but to the large open paddock behind the barn, the one with the best grass that overlooked the rolling hills. He unlatched the gate and swung it wide open. He didn't lead Sterling in. He simply stood back. This was the final test, the truest choice. There were no fences to the east, only miles of open country leading to the mountains. Sterling was free. No one was hunting him anymore. The scarred man was broken, his legend shattered, his organization dismantled. The horse could disappear, become a ghost in the wilderness, and never be beholden to a man again. Sterling stood at the open gate for a long moment. He lifted his head, tasting the wind, his eyes on the distant free horizon. He looked at the endless space, the promise of a life without walls or commands. Silas watched him, his heart in his throat. He had not done all this to own him. He had done it to free him. If the horse chose to leave, it would be a painful but right conclusion. After a long, silent minute, Sterling turned his head away from the open wilderness. He looked at Silas. His eyes, so recently blazing with the fire of combat, were now soft, calm, and filled with a profound, knowing intelligence. He took a deliberate step, not out into the wild, but into the paddock. He walked a few paces, then turned to face Silas, standing quietly inside the fence. He didn't run to the far side. He stayed near the gate. He stayed near the man who had seen him. He had chosen. He was home. Not a home of confinement, but a home of partnership. Not a place he was kept, but a place he had chosen to stay. Silas felt a wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He walked over and rested his forehead against Sterling's powerful neck, closing his eyes. The smell of horse, sweat, and dust filled his senses. It was the smell of a difficult, beautiful, and hard-earned peace. He had gone to an auction looking for nothing in particular and had found the truth of his life. That worth is not loud, that strength is often silent, and that the deepest bonds are not forged in ownership, but in a shared fight for freedom. He had seen the warrior beneath the veneer of the broken, and in trusting that vision, he had found not just a horse, but a brother to his own quiet soul. The sun sank below the horizon, leaving the valley in a gentle twilight. One man and one horse stood together in the gathering dark, two splintered and scarred souls who had, against all odds, built a home.